So project 9 is called Typologies in Photography. And the idea of a typology is that it's a collection of members of a common class or type, or I suppose group, subject. A photographic typology, the idea with it is that it's a set of repetitive images of the same subject, typically presented or traditionally presented as a grid. The idea of it is that it's going to show us the subtle differences between one sort of classification of subject. So to start, you should think about what subject you might have something unique to say about or be passionate about. This could be if you collect something, maybe it's a collection of items. Maybe it is something unique, like related to your major. If you're, I don't know, a psych major, or some major that is not art, that you have something really unique, sort of information that you could share with us, sort of, I don't want to say to educate us, but something where you can really talk about it in a unique way. Or maybe you are part of a community that is sort of unique, that you would want to photograph people of that community. So think about what interests you, what can you say uniquely about the world, what will really show through repetition. So it's like what small changes between one grouping of a subject can you really talk about when you see the same subject through repetition, or when you see the subtle changes of that subject. So when you go out and photograph, the important thing is to have a plan. So details matter. You should plan out the details before making the images. You should think about what sort of choices you have as a photographer that can help you photograph that subject in a consistent way, but also a way that shows those subtle changes as best possible. So, for example, making sure that you're the same height by using a tripod, having the same angle of view, your zoom, or maybe the angle of your camera, the composition, the framing, the distance, the lens focal length, being your zoom, sort of the orientation of the camera, whether it's horizontal or vertical, your lighting, particularly if you're photographing outdoors, trying to have your lighting be fairly consistent, angle of converging lines. I could go on this list, but keeping all the choices that you make as an artist as consistent as possible. So here's some examples by some historic artists, and the sort of inspiration for this project comes from this German couple. This is sort of a German aesthetic of looking at things in repetition. Uh, so Bern and Hella Becker are this husband and wife team who would photograph the same type of thing again and again and again. So here's three different examples of their work. So it's like barns, it's these gas spheres, and the water towers. And I always use this example of water towers. In some ways, it's the one where it's maybe the most boring, but it is the most, I think, relatable, because we all see water towers, right? And we're familiar with two or three different designs of water towers in the U.S. at least. Um, so you've got like the pole with a sphere on the top. You've got a pole with a big uh, cylinder on the top. Some are more like modern with curvy lines, and some of them are more just geometric. But Bernhiller Becker would photograph all over the European landscape, and even photographed in the U.S. as well. And there's a lot of historic water towers there where you can really see how it's serving the same purpose, but the design of it can be very different. I mean, it's all got a tank with water on the top, but for example, in this set, the pillars can look dramatically different, whether they're more designed or more just industrial. So they photograph them on cloudy days, so the shadows don't become distracting. They photograph in black and white, so color doesn't become distracting. And they photograph them from approximately the same distance. So the water tower fills up the same height of the frame, or it's the same, the horizon line is relatively consistent, but the height of the water tower overall becomes filling the top of the frame about the same. And then they also photograph them from a elevated vantage point when possible. So they'll get on a roof of a nearby building, or they'll bring scaffolding or something of that sort. So they're not photographing them like looking up at them, if that makes sense. They're trying to get a third halfway up the height of the water tower. Um, So, and then they're photographing them also, I should say, with a lens or a camera combination that allows them to not distort the vertical lines when they're looking at them, so that the vertical lines remain consistently vertical. Okay, so I'm going to skip through these and go in through some other history. So prior to them, there was this photographer, August Sander, who photographed pre-World War II Germany, looking at classifications of people. So in this case, it'd be like the laborers, the police and or military, and people that are more in a class of servants versus, I guess you would call them like professionals, like lawyers and doctors. Okay, other artists that work in this sort of vein, Louis Baltz, a California-based photographer. Look, I think it was in like Southern California, photographing the kind of mass development of um, warehouses or the sort of windowless structures. Daoud Bay, the Class Pictures project, photographing, I believe, all high school students, I think in CPS. And this is all kind of about their body language. So their head is in the same sort of place in the frame, but sometimes you see a little bit more in order to make a good composition. But it's all about kind of their comfort and their body language and how they represent themselves to the world. John Cry did this series photographing famous photographers' darkroom trays. So a little history: a darkroom tray would get stained by the chemistry, the silver particularly, when you're processing prints in a darkroom. And so these are different famous photographers' darkroom trays. Renike Dijkstra photographing it's not all, for some reason this slide has all girls, but photographing teens or kids that are going through puberty or have recently gone through puberty, and their kind of comfort level with their bodies and how they represent themselves, and of course photographing them on a beach in their bathing suits, because that is kind of the most vulnerable, I guess you could say, that someone might feel. Candida Hoffer photographing libraries. So these are all sorts of different, really old libraries, photographed always down the center of the structure, usually from an elevated perspective, if there is an ability to get up. So kind of looking down the central corridor or the central perspective of a library structure. Richard Mizrak lives near San Francisco, and this is his view out of his back, his back window or his back property. His property line backs up to the this view of the Golden Gate Bridge. So it's always the same composition, left, right, and the bridge is about the same position, height wise. So it's all about the sort of weather changing. Um, and how the same view can look dramatically different given that sort of time of day and weather conditions. Nicholas Nixon did this project now for 40 or 45 years, photographing his wife and her three sisters. I think it's called the Brown Sisters. And so it's always the same order of his wife and her three sisters, left to right. They're always in the same position, but they're photographed dramatically differently, closer, further, higher, lower. But it's all about kind of seeing the change of, I guess, in many ways that you see different clothing styles change, different hairstyles change, and you see them actually age throughout the course of 40 or so years. Martin Parr is I guess I call him the Instagram before Instagram photographer. He's been photographing food and making these sort of snapshots of food for many years. Most of the time, it's kind of gross food or really unique food in some way. Thomas Roof, another German photographer, did this project. I don't know exactly what the people were. I believe that they're all in the same general age, so they may all be students. I think he made this when he was in graduate school. This is many years back, but it's all done well, different. He's kind of had a progression of the series. Some of them are on different colored backgrounds, but I think the earliest work was just on this white background. I think they look a lot like a passport photo or even a mug shot, but the portrait's always kind of looking blankly in the camera. And so this tight crop, head and shoulders. But he prints them larger than life. They're like 3 or 4, maybe even 5 feet tall. So they become almost like godlike in their stature. And they're kind of staring into your soul. Ed Ruscha did this series, Every Building on the Sunset Strip, where he literally would just move the camera down the street, 40, 50 feet, and take another picture and take another picture and take another picture. And then he would present it where they're kind of lined up in this, I believe it's an accordion style book where you kind of fold it out and just keeps going and going and going. But it's every building kind of lined up, every picture sort of touches, the frames touch. And it's this continuous long picture. Mark Gerdwell did this project following abandoned train lines in the West. So these are all kind of like flat land, where there's the mounds for the train tracks, but the tracks themselves have been removed. Cuts through the mountain, and then entrances to tunnels. Paul Shambroom did this project, well, many projects about power, but this is one that's specifically about governmental power. And these are all sort of low-level county or school board or parks or some sort of small governmental body, and the way that they are sort of can represent power. That these are the voting members making the decisions at some level, but they're intentionally sort of the left 3 are structured layouts, and the right 3 are more just like, oh, we don't need to have this hierarchy or this formality quite the same way. Anyway, so all about power. Hiroshi Sugimoto, I think we've talked about before, but these are all theaters, all lit by the movie actually being played onto the scene and the light bouncing, or screen, and the light bouncing back out at the viewer. Susan Barnett did this. It's actually a whole book of graphic tees. And this is just one spread out of the book, where it is, the spread is essentially black t-shirt, white text. So they're all black t-shirts, white text. The next page might be, white t-shirts, black text, red text, white t-shirt, red t-shirt, white text, something of that sort. So they're all these graphic tees. So it's just always seeing the back of the person and reading the text. David Shoka-Ol did this series of isolated buildings. The idea with these are that it's in Chicago. He's done many different projects in different cities, but he was based in Chicago for a long time. And this is generally in neighborhoods where you've seen depopulation, where people have moved out for various reasons, particularly focusing on white flight and the sort of impact of that. Thinking about related things like redlining and that sort of population change increase, and particularly decreases when we're thinking about Chicago in general. So it's all one building centered. The lots next door to it are empty, photographed in a fairly consistent way. And there is a TED Talk that I'm going to post up by him. I would normally play this in class, but I think in this circumstance, it makes sense for you all to watch it. So look for this on D2L. It's TED Talk is less than 20 minutes, so it's relatively short, but it's some really great conversation about his process, and this is possibly really good inspiration for if anyone is interested in picking a topic that is social in nature. He's a trained. He's educated. He's got a degree in sociology, and he uses photography in order to kind of illustrate the research that he does. So here's some examples of what students have done over the years. So the first one here, I'll talk about some in more detail than others, but this one was a student that ran an X-ray machine at a CPS school. He wasn't a security guard, but he would help run them. And these are all examples of things that he has found and essentially had to be confiscated of students coming into it was one of the high schools. This is a series of different things happening in the living room from the point of view of the TV. Mailboxes, although if you were to do something like this, I would try to make them more consistent because there are a lot of inconsistencies in these. I'm going to skip over this one and kind of get into some of the more meaty ones at the end. Hairstyles, airplanes, shovels, fire hydrants, grills, doorknobs. So try to, I guess the reason I put these in is that these are well done, but they're maybe not as interesting, right? Because there isn't much that you can say about a door or a window, or maybe park benches are a little less interesting. So this is the sort of composition or the layout that we'll do. Typically 9 images, make sure that you're cropping them the same, otherwise that gets fairly distracting. White background, although if you wanted gray or black, I think that would be fine, but pretty consistently laid out. And what you can think about here is that the sort of 3 white cups have been intentionally laid out to be consistently on the left and right sides, and the ones that are different or more colorful or more bold are in the center. They're all maybe lit the same way. They're all placed with the mug handle to the same direction. So there are a lot of things happening here that you might not think about at first glance, but that are pretty significant on how to keep them as consistent as possible. Food. So a lot of these are done like in essentially studio with either it doesn't have to be studio, I guess I should say, with a white clean backdrop or a gray backdrop or a black backdrop, which could be just simply a sheet of a paper just rolled kind of from a desktop up onto a wall to make a clean line-free kind of desktop, and then using simply one light or in this case what this very well might be is just window light. So if you set up right next to a large window, you'll have a very clean, diffused light coming in, assuming that you're not getting direct sunlight, just having, bounce light, north light, or when the sun is not shining directly in at a different time of day. Car tires. I'd say with this one, be very careful about not cutting off things at the edge of your frame. So some of these, the tire gets cut off. Here's a student that lived in one of these like duplexes. This was his whole neighborhood. And you start noticing the differences, like in the bottom right one, there's different pavement, or maybe here there's 2 lanes wide a driveway versus only 1, or the windows are a different style, or the doors are painted differently, or there's an awning above it. So there's like little details happening. So this is one I would say is pretty well done because they're very consistently photographed. So we're getting just the same amount of relative street and space around it. This one here is a little distracting with the car, but generally they're photographed almost exactly the same, but you really start noticing those little changes in the way that the building is maybe differently composed on the right and the left, or differently modified, I guess would be a better way of saying it. Fans, students' camera collection. This guy went to like a Wild Wings or Buffalo Wings festival. Cigarette butts, detention slips, clocks, murals. This student this is themselves, I believe, and this is all different kind of dramatic makeup that they did. They're makeup artists, I believe. Sculptures, bagels. This student photographed their commute every time a car got uncomfortably close to them when they were riding their bike. they would snap a photo. So, this is like the 9 times they could have died on the commute to and from school. Lego figures, uh, bird figurines. So if you have like a collection of something, that tends to make a pretty good subject. The thing, this is on Devon. This is every building that was lit by LED lights. Uh, Unique clothing styles, signs that are added, like including or addition to a stop sign, tree growth, six-way intersections. So here's just some tips of composing. So if you're walking down the street, okay, Christopher Walken. All right, bad joke. When you're composing on the back of your camera, you could put a piece of plastic over it and like make marks of where a person's head should be laid out. Or in this case, this is one of David Schuckel's isolated building series. So you could, if you're photographing like buildings, you could make sure that the horizon line is consistently in the same place. The bottom of the building is in the same space, and then left to right, the building's the same sort of width in a frame. And then, if a building is taller or not, then that's maybe less of a factor. So some topics that you might, that I'd be encouraging you to kind of think about and maybe try and work with, some sort of social, political, economic related issue. Here's a long list. You don't have to choose one of these, but that is one of the sort of directions that this project can really, really work successfully in, is trying to get across some sort of larger issue. So just some quick thoughts when I go into this. The final composition should be 9 images laid out in a grid. It can be horizontal or vertical, whatever makes sense. I think I mentioned before that you probably want to make sure that your crop remains consistent across all 9 images. The assignment sheet says that you should photograph 50 images, but that doesn't that's not a hard set number where you're going to get a bad grade if you don't. Some people, if you have a collection of objects that you're photographing, I had a student do piggy banks, for example, and she had about a dozen or 15 piggy banks, and she wasn't going to go collect another 30 piggy banks to make this project. So it was a matter of, she'd photograph them, and we talk about how how they're, what's working, what's not working, until she found a formula that really worked successfully for all of them. So as a general goal, if you're out photographing in the world, I would try and photograph more, and photograph a variety of sort of ways of composing to make sure you get the right composition, especially for next week. The idea being that next week you're going to show work either Tuesday or Thursday. It should be one of those. It could be both of those, but at a minimum, show once in the next week. And show not just like 1 or 2 images. We need to see at least 5 or 10. Maybe a good goal would be 20 images, but again, depending on what your subject is, maybe that's more or less. And that way we can give you feedback this week. If you want to show it twice, I always say the more you show work, the more feedback you get, the more you can respond to it, the more likely you are to get an A. But at least once next week. And then the week that we have critique, you'll show on the Tuesday. Everyone should show that day, and that day we should be maybe focusing more on how to lay out your image. So in this case, well, let me find a different example. Okay, so here, this one, or maybe the clocks would be good. So like this one, well, this one's maybe a bad example, because the student probably should have photographed them all either straight on, or all from the right, or all from the left. So make sure you're doing it fairly consistently. Let me switch to the clocks, maybe is a better example. So in this one, perhaps when laying them out, we would be thinking about what makes a good composition. And honestly, I have some issues with the way this one's laid out, mainly being that we have some really bright images. Like generally these 4 feel like they are lighter, and they feel like they should be at the top more. And all 4 of these that are darker and heavier, or at least in the frames, should be at the bottom. This red one is the one that kind of stands out the most. So my feeling is that it probably should have gone in the middle. So this is the type of thing that we're going to talk about in that day before critique class, where we should be shuffling and kind of sorting to make sure that we're getting things laid out and talking about the composition of 9. That would be the goal for that day. And then 2 weeks from today, on Thursday, is when we'll actually critique. So let me see if I can go back a few, talk about one that is laid out really well. No, okay. I'm not sure which one I had talked about before, but so like this is a good example where things are grouped by color, right? Or perhaps we talked about this one, and this one kind of makes sense. The one that has the most like drawn in attention to text is the same, and the ones with text are in one row together, but they're also laid out so that ones that have little color are kind of on the sides, and the ones that are going to draw more attention through color are in the middle. So it's that sort of thing that you should be sort of thinking about and laying out. The other thing I wanted to say is that if you want to photograph 2 or 3 different topics, you're welcome to do that between now and say a week from now. The idea being that you could bring in 2 or 3 things. If something is working better than the other, we can give you feedback on it. Absolutely. Go with the one that's getting the best kind of response, or the one that seems to be, people respond to the most. Absolutely a great idea. There's a video online of how to lay out things like this in Lightroom, so make sure you check that out. In order to sort them, you have to sort kind of number 1, top left corner, going across in the rows down to the bottom right corner. So you always have to kind of shuffle, but you have to put it into a collection in order to do that. So make sure you watch that video if you don't know how to do that. I think that just about wraps it up. So I'll stop there.